What secret can you reveal now that your NDA has expired? I worked logistics for film productions for years, handling the secret demands of Hollywood's biggest stars, and I once had to fulfill a contract that literally required the crew to play a full orchestral soundtrack every time an actor walked onto set, or else we could have faced a lawsuit. Years ago, I worked in logistics for film productions, basically the person who had to deal with the weird behind-the-scenes requests nobody else wanted to handle. Most actors had the usual stuff, certain snacks, specific trailers, quiet hours, that kind of thing. But two contracts I handled still make me laugh when I think about them. The first one involved an actor who was incredibly serious about not being surprised. I don't mean in a normal way. I mean it was written into the production notes that no one was allowed to approach him from behind or enter his trailer unannounced. Ever. Not even the director. Crew had to knock, then wait for him to verbally say clear before opening the door. If someone forgot and just walked in, he'd immediately stop working for the day. The weird part is he wasn't rude about it at all. He'd just calmly say, "We'll try again tomorrow." Eventually we learned the reason. He hated sudden interruptions so much that the rule existed purely to keep his stress level down. Once people followed it, he was actually one of the easiest actors on the entire project. The second one was the complete opposite energy. This performer never had anything written into their contract. No requests, no writers, nothing. But they treated the production like a long-running prey. Every morning they'd hand me a completely new requirement written on a napkin or scrap paper. Not real ones either. Things like one chair on set that must remain mysteriously empty, a bowl of lemons that no one is allowed to acknowledge. Someone from wardrobe must say "Good morning, Captain," when I arrived. At first, the producers panicked and thought we had to fulfill all of them. Eventually, we realized he was doing it to keep the crew entertained during a long shoot. Half the time, he'd forget about the request entirely and laugh when we actually did it. One day, he asked for a dramatic entrance soundtrack whenever he walked on set. So the sound department started playing a ridiculous orchestral theme from someone's phone speaker whenever he showed up. He laughed so hard he had to sit down before filming. Story 2. I worked for years maintaining self-service kiosks in grocery stores, and I discovered that every single person who had ever used one, thousands of people, had their names, phone numbers, and private details just sitting in a hidden folder, completely unprotected for anyone with a laptop to steal. Several years ago, I worked for a company that installed and maintained self-service kiosks in grocery stores and shopping malls. They weren't movie rentals. These are machines people use to print tickets, check reservations, and occasionally make small payments. My job wasn't glamorous. I traveled around updating the software and replacing broken hardware. Most visits were routine. Plug in a keyboard, run an update, restart the machine, leave. One afternoon, I connected a maintenance laptop to a kiosk that kept freezing. While digging through its system folders, I noticed a directory labeled archive_backup. That wasn't unusual. Machines keep logs for troubleshooting. But when I opened it, the files inside weren't technical logs at all. They were customer transaction records. Names, partial addresses, phone numbers, reservation details, timestamps, thousands of entries. The worst part, they weren't encrypted, not hidden, not protected behind any special permissions, just sitting there like a spreadsheet someone forgot about. I assumed it was a mistake on that one machine, so I called our internal support line. The guy on the other end paused for a second and said something that stuck with me. "Yeah, those have been there since the first software build. Apparently, the original developers had created a quick logging system during early testing so they could track transaction errors. The feature was never properly removed when the kiosks went nationwide, and nobody thought to check the storage later. By that point, the machines had been operating for years. Every time a customer used one, another record was quietly added to that folder. To be clear, I never copied anything, and neither did the other technicians I worked with. But the realization was unsettling, because anyone with the same maintenance access could have opened those files. When the company eventually rolled out a major system overhaul, the focus was on updating the interface and speeding up transactions. Data cleanup was barely mentioned. I remember asking my supervisor whether the old archives were being wiped during the upgrade. He shrugged and said, "They'll probably overwrite themselves eventually." That was the official solution. I left the company not long after that project wrapped up. As far as I know, those original kiosks were slowly replaced over time. Story 3. I worked for a financial company where my job was to spot fraud, but the system secretly forced us to freeze innocent people's accounts, including retirees and remote workers, just to meet our hourly quotas. A few years ago, I was part of a support unit for a large financial services company. I wasn't a teller or customer-facing employee. My job was in the background reviewing automated alerts the system generated. Whenever certain patterns appeared in an account, large transfers, unusual locations, sudden spikes in activity, the software flagged it and sent it to our team. In theory, we were supposed to carefully examine each case before deciding whether it was suspicious. In practice, it didn't really work that way. The company tracked our performance by volume. Each analyst had a quota for how many alerts they needed to process per shift. If you spent too long investigating one case, your numbers dropped and supervisors started asking questions. So most people learned to make very fast decisions. The system might show something like a retiree suddenly receiving several large deposits. On paper, it looked strange. In reality, it could have been something totally harmless, selling property, an insurance payout, inheritance money, things like that. But properly verifying that meant digging through documents, contacting other departments, sometimes even waiting for additional records. That could take hours, and nobody had hours. So what usually happened was the analyst made a quick judgment based on the surface level information. If it looked unusual enough, the account got escalated or restricted while another department handled it later. The problem was that the second review didn't always happen quickly. Sometimes customers found out only when their cards stopped working or a payment failed. I remember one case where an account looked suspicious because money kept coming in from different countries every month. At first glance, it resembled a classic fraud pattern. But after actually reading the notes, I realized the person worked remotely for multiple international clients. Completely legitimate income. If I had processed it the same way most alerts were handled, their account would have been frozen without warning. That experience stuck with me. Not because anyone was trying to hurt customers. Most of my coworkers genuinely cared. The issue was the system rewarded speed far more than accuracy. Eventually, you stop questioning alerts and start treating them like items on a checklist. This job is pure corporate nonsense. They set quotas so high that analysts have to rush through alerts like it's a race. Speed over everything. Big transfers or weird patterns. Most just flag it fast and move on. No real checking. Innocent people end up with frozen accounts and bounce payments, while actual fraud sometimes slips by because everyone's too busy hitting numbers. You actually stopped, read the details, and didn't screw over the legitimate remote worker. That's doing the job the right way. Most people get worn down and stop caring because the system punishes slow, careful work. The company isn't really fighting fraud. It's fighting accuracy to look good on paper. ITA verdict, NTA at all. You showed real care in a setup designed to kill it. The big problem is the broken quota system and the people who built it. Before we move on to the next story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let me know your favorite part in the comments and share your own story too. Has anything like this ever happened to you? Story 4. I worked at a publishing company where I discovered, just days before printing, that a famous author's entire manuscript was secretly copied from another writer, entire chapters lifted almost word for word. I worked in the production department of a mid-sized publishing company. My role wasn't glamorous. I handled the final formatting stage right before manuscripts went to the printers. Basically, I was the last person who checked the book files before thousands of copies were produced. One project nearly turned into a disaster. The manuscript came from a very well-known writer with a long track record of successful releases. Everyone in the office assumed it would be another easy bestseller. Marketing campaigns were already being prepared and the release date had been announced months ahead of time. While preparing the layout, I noticed something odd. The tone of the writing shifted dramatically in the middle of one chapter. Not just the subject matter, the rhythm of the sentences changed. The vocabulary was slightly different, and the pacing felt like it belonged to another voice entirely. At first, I thought maybe the author had experimented with a different narrative style. But the more I read, the more it felt familiar. That feeling bothered me enough that I started digging. I spent the next couple of evenings searching through older novels and essays that had similar themes. Eventually, I stumbled across a book from years earlier, written by a completely different author. And there it was. Several passages in our manuscript mirrored scenes from that older book, almost beat for beat, not word for word, but close enough that anyone comparing them side by side would immediately notice. The scary part was the timeline. The printing deadline was only days away. If the book had gone out like that, the original writer or their publisher would almost certainly have caught it eventually. And that kind of legal fight can cost a publishing house a fortune. I brought everything to one of the senior editors along with the excerpts I had marked. Within a few hours, the entire project was frozen. Meetings started happening behind closed doors. Marketing materials were quietly pulled, and the scheduled release date disappeared from the company website almost overnight. I never heard the full outcome, but the manuscript was never printed, and the author involved have never worked with a company again. Story 5. I worked for a rapid growth marketing company where the real business wasn't selling services. It was trapping customers in an endless cancellation maze so they keep paying for nothing. I took a job at what was advertised as a rapid growth marketing company. The pitch sounded legitimate. We supposedly help small businesses expand their customer base through subscription-based service packages. My job was simple. Call potential clients, explain the service, and sign them up. At first, everything seemed normal. There were daily meetings, motivational speeches, and leaderboards showing who had sold the most packages that week. New hires were constantly being brought in, and management talked nonstop about how fast the company was expanding. But after a couple of months, things started feeling strange. Clients occasionally called back saying they didn't understand what service they had actually purchased. When those calls reached our floor, we weren't allowed to answer questions ourselves. Instead, we had to transfer them to a specialized support department. That department apparently handled everything, except no one I knew had ever met anyone from that team. Whenever I asked supervisors where the support staff worked, they'd vaguely say something like, another office. Eventually, I noticed something else odd. Customers who tried to cancel kept getting transferred repeatedly, sometimes for hours. Later, I learned why. A coworker who had been there longer let it slip during lunch that the company's main strategy wasn't delivering the service. It was making the cancellation process so frustrating that most people eventually gave up trying. The real shock came at one of the company's annual gatherings. Management rented out a large venue and held an award ceremony for top performers. People walked on stage while giant screens displayed their earnings. The numbers were enormous, figures that didn't remotely match the kind of business we were supposedly doing. At first, the room was cheering. Then you could feel the mood shift. Even some employees started looking confused about how those numbers were even possible. Halfway through the event, the presentation suddenly stopped, and the hosts awkwardly moved on to dinner. A few months later, the company name quietly disappeared. Story 6. I worked a call center for a massive electronics brand where we were secretly trained to lie to customers about who we really worked for, and I got fired for helping a blind man set up his device because I accidentally interrupted him twice during the hour-long call. For a while, I worked in a technical help center for a very well-known consumer electronics brand. When people called the support number printed on their device packaging, they assumed they were speaking directly to the company that built the product. Technically, that wasn't true. Our office belonged to a completely separate contractor hired to handle customer support on their behalf. That part isn't unusual in the industry, but the part that surprised me was how carefully we were instructed to avoid mentioning it. During training, we were told that if a customer asked where we worked, we should say we were part of the company's support team and leave it at that. We were never supposed to mention the outsourcing firm that actually employed us. The scripts were written very carefully to make it sound like we were inside the manufacturer's own offices. The situation became more complicated when the company started moving operations between different regions. Over a few months, new teams were added in other countries while our office slowly reduced staff. At the same time, management introduced stricter performance evaluations. Every call was recorded and graded by internal reviewers who followed a checklist of tiny rules: exact phrasing, precise timing, whether you paused long enough after a customer finished speaking, things like that. The strange part was that customer satisfaction didn't always matter as much as the checklist. I remember one call where a customer had been struggling to set up accessibility options on their device. We spent almost half an hour walking through the settings until everything worked perfectly. They were extremely grateful and even mentioned they planned to send positive feedback. A week later, my evaluation came back with a failing score for that exact call. The reason? I had spoken at the same time as the caller twice during the conversation, which technically counted as interrupting them under the scoring rules. It didn't matter that the issue was solved. The metrics said the call was bad, so officially it was bad. Not long after that, our office started shrinking as more work shifted elsewhere. This is textbook corporate smoke and mirrors. Customers call the big brand's number, expecting direct help from the company that made their device. Instead, it's a separate contractor, and you're trained to dodge the truth with vague lines like part of the support team. Scripts hide the outsourcing layers perfectly. Then they nitpick every call with a brutal checklist: exact phrasing, perfect pauses, zero overlap, even if you solve the problem and the customer loves you. You spend 30 minutes fixing accessibility issues. Customer is thrilled and promises great feedback. Boom. Failing score for interrupting twice. Actual results don't count. The rules do. It's all theater. Fake direct connection, robotic scoring over real help, and shrinking offices as work moves cheaper. Customers think premium service. Reality is stressed agents chasing checkboxes in a disappearing call center. AITA verdict. NDA. You gave real patient help and fixed the issue. That's good service. The failing score proves the system is broken, not you. The real problem is the misleading setup, the checklist obsession, and the company hiding it all. Before we move move on to the next story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let me know your favorite part in the comments, and share your own story too. Has anything like this ever happened to you? Story 7. A little over a decade ago, I accepted a job helping set up the technical infrastructure for a rapidly growing online entertainment platform. The company described itself as a digital gaming startup that planned to stream real-time table games to players across several countries. My role was supposed to be straightforward: maintain servers, keep the video feed stable, and make sure players could connect without lag. At the beginning, everything looked legitimate. The company rented a large studio space overseas where cameras were mounted above several gaming tables. Dealers sat under bright lights, smiling into the lens while interacting with remote players through microphones and chat windows. Behind the scenes, my team handled the networking equipment and the streaming systems that delivered those feeds to users around the world. But after a few months, I started noticing things that didn't make sense. For one, the company was spending money at a completely ridiculous pace. Equipment purchases were approved instantly, executives flew internationally every other week, and luxury offices were being opened in multiple cities, even though the platform itself was still fairly new. Meanwhile, the people actually running the technical side were cutting corners just to keep the system online. The first real red flag came during a training session for newly hired dealers. One of them asked whether we were using the manual override use. I had no idea what that meant. Later that evening, one of the senior floor managers explained it quietly. Certain high-value players were being monitored during live sessions. When those players placed unusually large wagers after a streak of similar results, the managers wanted the option to influence the next round, not through the software, because that system was audited and had to meet strict probability standards. Instead, they were talking about physical adjustments during the game itself. The dealers had subtle signals they could receive through earpieces or hand gestures from supervisors off camera. Those signals told them when to shuffle early, slow down the dealing process, or introduce cards in ways that shifted the outcome slightly. The explanation I was given was that every competitor in the region did something similar. Apparently, some platforms would operate normally for months, collect massive betting activity, and then quietly shut down before regulators or players started asking too many questions. Around that same time, our investors began disappearing. Funding stopped arriving, salaries started getting delayed, and the leadership team suddenly became very difficult to contact. Within weeks, the operation unraveled completely. The studio closed, equipment was sold off, and most employees scattered to other jobs. The strange part was what happened afterward. A few months later, I saw a new platform online that looked almost identical to the one we had built. Same style of streaming tables, same marketing approach, even some of the same executives listed under different company names. Story 8. I worked at a store where we sold $6 holiday ornaments to customers who were told they were donating to charity for families in need. But I discovered in the stockroom that thousands of those ornaments were already sitting on pallets, pre-shipped to the charities whether anyone bought them or not. Years ago, I had a seasonal job at a large chain store that sold home goods and small electronics. Every winter, they ran a big promotion encouraging customers to support a holiday charity drive. At the checkout counter, we were supposed to ask every shopper if they wanted to purchase a small decorative ornament that would help support community outreach programs. Each ornament cost about $6. The script we were given made it sound like buying one meant the company would donate that exact item to families and community centers. Posters showed pictures of kids opening gift boxes and volunteers handing out decorations during holiday events. Naturally, a lot of people said yes. After a few weeks working there, I ended up helping in the stockroom where all the promotional items were kept. That's when I noticed something strange. Huge pallets of those ornaments were sitting in storage, thousands of them. I asked the warehouse supervisor how many had actually been sold so far. He checked the numbers and told me only a fraction of the inventory had been purchased by customers. So I asked the obvious question, what happens to the rest? He casually explained that once the promotion ended, all the unsold ornaments would be sent to the same charities anyway. Apparently, that had been the plan from the beginning. The difference was that when a customer bought one at the register, the company recorded it as part of the donation campaign tied to that purchase. But the items themselves were already destined for those organizations regardless of whether customers bought them. That realization made the whole promotion feel very different. Customers thought they were personally funding those donations by purchasing an ornament. In reality, the company had already ordered massive quantities for distribution and simply wrapped the process in a retail campaign. To be fair, the charities still received the items in the end, which was a positive outcome. But watching people at the checkout counter proudly pay extra because they believed they were directly sending something to a family in need, while knowing the shipments were happening either way left a strange feeling. Story 9. I worked at a pharmacy where a whole category of medications had expired on the shelves for over a month, and nobody noticed because a new manager rearranged the checklist and accidentally made those drugs no one's responsibility. Many years ago, I worked as a pharmacy technician at a busy neighborhood drugstore. Behind the counter, there were strict routines meant to keep everything organized and safe. Every type of medication had someone assigned to check inventory, rotate stock, and make sure nothing stayed on the shelves past its expiration date. Normally, the system worked pretty well. Each week, we reviewed different sections: heart medications, antibiotics, pain relief, and other categories. The tasks were divided among pharmacists and technicians so that no one area would be overlooked. Then a new store manager arrived. During her first week, she reorganized the entire checklist board where responsibilities were posted. Instead of following the previous layout, she grouped medicines differently and reassigned who checked what. At first, it seemed like a harmless administrative change, but one small problem appeared that no one noticed right away. A particular group of medications, ones that weren't prescribed nearly as often as the others, never ended up listed under anyone's name after the board was rearranged. Because of that, nobody was officially responsible for checking that section during the weekly rotation. The bottles were still sitting in the cabinet exactly where they had always been. Since prescriptions for them came in only occasionally, the stock stayed there untouched for quite a while. Every time someone filled one of those prescriptions, they simply grabbed a bottle from the shelf without thinking much about it. It took nearly a month before someone finally realized those boxes hadn't been reviewed during the usual inventory checks. When we looked closely at the dates printed on them, several had already passed the manufacturer's recommended window. New manager reorganizes the checklist board, accidentally leaves a whole section of rarely used meds off everyone's assignment. For almost a month, those bottles sit unchecked and some expire quietly on the shelf. No one notices until a close look reveals the oversight. Luckily, no harm done, no complaints, no incidents, but it was a scary near miss. The fix was simple, required 2 sign-offs per category, but it showed how one small change can quietly break a tight safety system. ITA verdict. Not the a-hole. NTA for the technician/storyteller. You follow the posted assignments correctly. The new manager is the clear a-hole here for rearranging responsibilities without double-checking that every section still had an owner. That's poor oversight in a job where mistakes can matter. Before we move on to the next story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let me know your favorite part in the comments and share your own story too. Has anything like this ever happened to you? Story 18. I finally figured out how my coworker became a sales genius overnight. He was charging customers for a product they didn't want, hadn't asked for, and in some cases would never even know existed. Management called it streamlining the experience. I called it legalized theft with a name tag. While back I worked at a retail store for a large telecom provider. Our main job was straightforward: help people set up phone plans, upgrade devices, and occasionally bundle in extra services if it made sense. At least that's how it was explained during training. In reality, there was one particular add-on the company was obsessed with pushing. It was a premium service, expensive, not really necessary for most customers, and honestly confusing to explain unless someone specifically asked about it. Management tracked it heavily. Every morning we'd have meetings where numbers were posted on a screen. Most of us struggled to sell even a couple of these add-ons in an entire week. It just didn't fit the needs of the people walking into our store. Then one coworker's numbers suddenly went through the roof. We're talking multiple sales per day. At first, everyone assumed they had some incredible pitch or secret technique. So one afternoon I asked them how they were managing. They didn't hesitate. They told me they weren't really selling it at all. They were just building it into every transaction automatically. When customers came in to activate a service, the add-on was included in the setup by default unless the customer specifically noticed and objected. Most people didn't. Either they trusted the process or they were focused on getting their main service working and didn't question the details. I was honestly taken aback. To me, that crossed a line. So I brought it up to a supervisor, thinking it would be addressed. Instead, I got a very different response. They didn't deny what was happening. They just pointed at the sales numbers and said something along the lines of, "Results speak for themselves." After that, the pressure shifted. We were encouraged to streamline the customer experience, which was a polite way of saying we should make it easier to include the add-on without drawing too much attention to it. I couldn't get comfortable with that approach. I stayed for a bit longer, but it became clear that success there wasn't really about helping customers choose what they needed. It was about how effectively you could attach extra services to every interaction. Eventually, I moved on. Story 19. Ever been told by your bank that an old account doesn't exist or that they can't find the records? I have some bad news. I worked in the department where we literally hid those accounts on purpose. We didn't lose your money. We just made it impossible for you to prove you had it. Years ago, I worked in a document processing processing unit for a financial institution. My role was pretty dull on paper. I handled archived records and helped retrieve old account files when customers requested historical statements or verification. Most requests were simple. Someone needed proof of an old transaction. We pulled the file, sent it over, and that was that. But every so often, a request would come through where the system couldn't immediately locate the account. At first, I assumed it was just a technical issue. Maybe a typo. Maybe the account was very old. But when I dug deeper, I noticed something odd. Some of these accounts hadn't disappeared. They had been moved. There was a secondary internal database used for accounts labeled as inactive or closed under review. These weren't visible through the normal system employees used at the front desks. Access required additional permissions that only certain departments had. What bothered me was how difficult it was to move those accounts back. Once an account was placed into that category, it triggered a chain of internal steps before it could be restored to normal status. Each step required approval from a different team, and none of those teams seemed in a hurry to act. Meanwhile, if a customer came in asking about their funds, the frontline staff often couldn't even see the account in their system. From their perspective, it looked like the account simply didn't exist anymore. I asked a senior colleague about it once. They explained that those cases were considered low visibility unless the customer escalated aggressively or had someone advocating on their behalf. Otherwise, the process could take a very long time to resolve. Not because it couldn't be fixed, but because it wasn't being prioritized. Story 20. My job was to make million-dollar factory equipment look like it was on sale. We'd mark up a $500 circuit board to $5,000, then generously cut the price in half during negotiations. The customer thought they won. The company knew they just paid 10 times what the thing was worth. A few years ago, I worked on the sales support side of a company that supplied specialized industrial systems, stuff used in factories to monitor, control, and automate processes. My job wasn't to sell directly, but to prepare quotes and configure packages before they went out to clients. From the outside, these systems looked incredibly advanced, and they were. Complex hardware, custom installations, and proprietary software all bundled together. So naturally, I assumed the high prices reflected high costs. Then I got access to the internal breakdown. Each product had two numbers, the cost to produce it and the price we were supposed to offer the customer. What surprised me wasn't that there was a margin. That's normal. It was how wildly different those numbers could be depending on the item. For certain core components, the production cost was only a small fraction of the listed price. Not slightly lower, dramatically lower. And these weren't rare, niche items either. They were the most commonly ordered parts. It got even more interesting when it came to the software. Once the system was installed, clients needed licenses to actually run and expand it. Those licenses weren't physical products. They were just digital keys that unlock features already built into the system. Internally, those licenses were treated as nearly pure margin. What really explained everything, though, was how pricing was handled in negotiations. Clients almost never paid the listed price. Instead, large discounts were expected, sometimes huge ones. It wasn't unusual to see quotes reduced by more than half during negotiations, especially for big contracts. At first, that seemed like we were giving away massive deals. But after seeing the internal numbers, it made sense. Even after those discounts, the company was still comfortably profitable. In fact, the high initial pricing was part of the strategy. It created room to negotiate while still protecting margins. From the customer's perspective, they felt like they had secured a great deal. From the company's perspective, it was all built into the system from the start. I stayed in that role for a while, but that experience changed how I look at pricing in industries like that. Your story exposes classic industrial B2B pricing. List prices set very high to allow big discounts during negotiation while still keeping strong margins. Software licenses are almost pure profit. Customers feel they won a great deal. The company planned it that way from the start. It's standard practice in this industry, not a secret, just business theater most people already understand once they see the numbers, the AITA verdict, not AITA. You saw how the system works, updated your view, and moved on without harming anyone. That's normal, not wrong. Before we move on to the next story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let me know your favorite part in the comments and share your own story too. Has anything like this ever happened to you? Story 21. I was paid to guard a door that I was never ever allowed to open, but I was also told that if it ever did open by itself, my job was no longer to guard it. It was to assume we were already under attack and react accordingly. To this day, I have no idea what was behind it, and I think that's the point. In the early 2000s, I was assigned to a security unit stationed in a remote training area. On paper, our job was simple: protect a restricted logistics site. That was the exact wording. No further details. The location itself was oddly placed, just off a a public road, partially hidden by dense woodland, with nothing around it except fencing, cameras, and a handful of low concrete structures that didn't look like typical military buildings. From the outside, it didn't look like much. Inside, it was different. The perimeter had multiple layers, and access was tightly controlled even for personnel already stationed there. Certain sections required separate authorization, and there were areas we were specifically told not to approach unless given direct orders. What stood out most was how the site was divided. There were 2 operational zones, each run by different teams. We handled the outer perimeter and general security, while another group, who didn't report through our chain of command, controlled a sealed inner section. We saw them occasionally during shift changes, but interaction was minimal. Different uniforms, different protocols, different everything. There was exactly one connection point between the 2 zones, a reinforced door inside a shared service corridor. It stayed locked at all times. During training, we were told that if that door ever opened unexpectedly, it would trigger a full defensive response. No hesitation, no questions, just immediate action to secure the area. That kind of instruction tends to stick with you. Every now and then, specialized vehicles would arrive without any prior notice. They'd pass through both security checkpoints under heavy supervision, stay for a short period, and then leave the same way. No one explained what they were transporting. No one asked. The entire assignment had an unspoken rule. You didn't speculate, you didn't discuss, and you definitely didn't try to find out more than you were told. Story 22. I had a login that could tell you exactly where any celebrity, politician, or CEO was sleeping on any given night for the last 5 years. I wasn't a spy or a hacker. I just worked in logistics. And the scariest part, nobody was watching me look. Years ago, I worked for a logistics company that handled high-level travel coordination. Not vacations or tourist stuff. This was all behind-the-scenes planning for official delegations, corporate executives, and occasionally government-related trips. My role was to arrange transportation and accommodation based on internal requests that came through our system. At first, it just felt like data entry. Then I realized what that data actually was. The system we used wasn't limited to current bookings. It stored historical records going back years. With a few searches, I could see detailed itineraries, where people stayed, when they traveled, who they were meeting, even the preferences attached to their profiles. Some entries were marked as sensitive, but the difference was mostly just a label. If you had the right login level, you could still view everything. Contact details were there too. Direct phone numbers, work emails, sometimes even notes about security arrangements or special handling instructions. It wasn't hidden. It was just there. One day I was assigned a routine booking that stood out because of how much attention it received internally. Multiple approvals, last-minute changes, and very specific requests about privacy. Out of curiosity, I checked the profile attached to the booking. It belonged to a public figure who had been all over the news at the time. Seeing their entire travel history laid out in front of me, past trips, locations, patterns, was honestly unsettling. Not because I intended to do anything with that information, but because it was so easy to access. And I wasn't the only one who could see it. Dozens of employees had the same level of access I did. Story 22. I went to a party where the guests were richer than gods and more miserable than prisoners. We had to sign NDAs just to get in. Our phones were locked in pouches, and the whole night was so perfectly choreographed that it felt like a funeral for people who were still alive, just buried in their own money. I ended up attending a private event as a guest of someone I knew through work. Before even stepping inside, we had to go through a check-in process that felt more like airport security than a celebration. Phones were sealed. Cameras were prohibited. And yes, everyone had to sign a confidentiality agreement just to be there. At first, I assumed it was just about privacy. Then I saw the scale of the event. It wasn't just expensive. It was engineered to look perfect. Every detail had been curated down to the smallest element. Lighting, music timing, how guests were guided from one area to another. There were entire teams working behind the scenes to make sure nothing appeared out of place. But the people themselves didn't match that perfection. Instead of excitement, there was this strange tension in the air. Conversations felt rehearsed. People kept glancing around, like they were aware they were being observed even when they weren't. I remember one moment in particular. A group gathered for speeches, and you'd expect it to feel personal, celebrating the people at the center of the event. But most of what was said focused on status, achievements, and connections. It felt less like a heartfelt occasion and more like a performance. Meanwhile, the guests who weren't part of that inner circle mostly stayed on the sidelines, quietly watching. Another odd thing was how casually money was treated. Plans changed constantly. Entire setups were rearranged on short notice, not because something went wrong, but simply because someone important decided they preferred something different. Staff would scramble, adjust everything, and act like it had always been that way. From the outside, it probably looked incredible. From the inside, it felt detached. Story 23. I once watched my entire office turn into a crime scene because a portable hard drive full of active criminal investigations was left sitting on a desk for 3 hours. When it vanished, we didn't call the police. We sent a team. And by the end of the day, the drive was back, and I was told to never speak about it again. I worked IT support for a mid-sized data services contractor. We weren't flashy, just one of those companies that quietly manage back-end systems for bigger clients. My role was mostly routine, system migrations, backups, hardware swaps. One project, though, was different. We were asked to assist with relocating a secure data environment from one office to another. The instructions were clear: move everything quickly, minimize downtime, and make sure no data was lost in the process. To speed things up, one of the senior engineers decided to create a full backup of a specific database onto a portable drive so it could be restored at the new location without relying on network transfers. At the time, that didn't seem unusual. What was unusual was what the database contained. I didn't have full access to its contents, but from the file structure and labels, it was obvious it held detailed records tied to ongoing investigations, logs, identifiers, timestamps, things that clearly weren't meant to be casually handled. It should have been locked down, encrypted, tracked. Instead, during the move, that drive ended up sitting on a shared desk in a staging area, unattended, 4 hours. By the time someone realized it was missing, the entire floor went into panic mode. Access logs were pulled, security footage reviewed, and within a short time they had a pretty good idea of who had been in that area during the window when it disappeared. What followed was something I only heard about secondhand from a colleague who was closer to the situation. Apparently, the response was immediate and very direct. A team was dispatched to retrieve the device as quickly as possible. There was no waiting around for formal processes to play out. The drive was recovered the same day. Oh wow, look at this masterpiece of corporate security theater. Your company is supposedly handling sensitive investigation data for serious clients, yet some genius senior engineer decides the fastest way to move a ticking time bomb database is to slap the whole unencrypted thing onto a random portable drive like at vacation photos. Then they leave said drive chilling on a desk in the open like a forgotten lunchbox. Hours pass. Nobody notices. Drive vanishes. Cue full deer in headlights meltdown, security footage CSI episode, SWAT team style recovery squad dispatched like it's a national emergency. And surprise, they actually got it back the same day. This is peak mid-sized contractor energy. Treat classified level data like it's a spare USB of cat memes. Panic like the sky is falling the second it grows legs. Then act like the heroic retrieval somehow erases the fact that the entire chain of custody was one giant facepalm. The only thing missing was a big sign on the drive that said, "Steal me for blackmail material. Free. AITA verdict, not AITA. You were just the low-level IT guy doing routine work who happened to witness a colossal clown show run by people way above your pay grade. You didn't touch the drive, didn't take it, didn't ignore warnings. You literally just saw the disaster unfold. Being horrified at how stupidly sensitive data was handled doesn't make you the asshole. It makes you the only person in the story with functioning risk awareness. The real clowns were the ones who approved that backup method and then left nuclear material on a shared table. You get a pass. Before we move on to the next story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let me know your favorite part in the comments and share your own story too. Has anything like this ever happened to you? Story 24. Every day, I went to work wearing a uniform with a famous logo, following orders from their managers and representing their brand to the public. But the moment I made a mistake that cost them money, I was suddenly invisible. My employer and their client spent weeks arguing over who I really worked for, while I realized I was just a liability to be passed back and forth. I worked in operations for a large facilities company that handled maintenance and on-site services for major brands. On paper, everything was very clean. Our company provided staff, but the contract made it very clear that we were a separate entity. The big client, the one whose logo was everywhere, wasn't supposed to be directly tied to anything we did. At least, that's how it was written. In reality, it looked completely different. Our teams wore uniforms with the client's branding. We worked inside their buildings, followed their schedules, and took instructions from their managers. To anyone walking in, there was no distinction. We were that company. Then an incident happened. One of the workers on our team made a mistake during a routine task that caused damage on site. Nothing catastrophic, but serious enough that it led to complaints and eventually legal attention. Immediately, the response from both sides kicked in. Our company pointed to the contract and said, "We are responsible for our employees." The client pointed to the same contract and said, "They're not our employees." On paper, it seems straightforward. But once things escalated, the situation became more complicated. From what I later heard through internal discussions, the key issue wasn't who technically employed the worker. It was how the situation appeared from the outside. Customers and third parties had interacted with that that worker, believing they represented the larger brand. That perception mattered a lot. Behind closed doors, there were long meetings, back-and-forth arguments, and a noticeable shift in tone. Suddenly, the neat separation outline in the contract didn't seem as solid as everyone had assumed. After that, changes started happening. Story 25. I worked for a company that charged terrified people hundreds of dollars a year to protect them from fraud monsters that didn't exist. The truth? You can lock your credit for free in about 10 minutes. But we never told them that. We just kept taking their money and soothing their late-night panic attacks. I worked for a major credit reporting company, handling inbound support calls. My department wasn't just managing credit reports. We were also fielding calls for a dozen different identity protection and monitoring companies that had contracted with us. Some of these packages cost hundreds of dollars a year, and the pitch made them sound like they were protecting people from actual criminals at all times. Here's the thing. Most of the time, they weren't. Locking your 3 major credit bureaus yourself gives you the same level of protection. The subscriptions mostly just gave instant alerts whenever anything touched your credit file, which most people don't need unless they are obsessively tracking every tiny change. Every day, we get calls from people panicking because they saw a hit on their credit that they didn't recognize. A lot of these calls were completely unnecessary. Some customers were polite, some were frantic, and some were downright abusive. The weirdest were always the ones who had been drinking. One gentleman called almost every night for a month straight, slurring so badly it was almost impossible to understand him. He'd accuse us of ignoring the fraud monsters and demand immediate action, even though everything in his report was fine and he had been told the same thing over and over. Eventually, I started learning which calls were hopeless. I politely tried to explain, and when it went nowhere, I'd pass it along or sometimes end the call if it turned aggressive. You learn to compartmentalize the absurdity quickly. Story 26. I worked at a payments company where a junior employee with no hacking skills could have stolen millions. The admin passwords were a joke, the testing systems were connected to real data, and the only thing stopping theft was the hope that nobody would notice. Gift cards weren't just currency, they were untraceable cash machines for anyone bold enough to poke around. You'd never believe how easy it is for someone inside the system to manipulate money flowing through it. I worked for a mid-sized digital payments company doing interface design a few years ago, and the reality behind the scenes was shocking. Most people assume these systems are airtight because they see the security certifications, two-factor authentication, and encryption. What they don't realize is that the real weak point isn't the software, the humans who hold the keys. High-level access is often given to managers and executives who have zero technical training. If someone knows the system, it's almost trivial to exploit these gaps. I once watched a junior employee discover they could temporarily cache card numbers for testing purposes, something that should have been sandboxed completely. They weren't supposed to even access real transactions, but because the admin passwords were lazily managed, it was like the vault door was wide open. With a little manipulation, you could create phantom refunds, reroute charges to a different account, or even offload funds in a way that looked completely legitimate on paper. And most of the time, no one would notice unless someone audited it specifically. Gift cards were even worse. Every store brand card system I reviewed was basically a gold mine for anyone with insider access. Employees could load cards with arbitrary amounts, move funds between accounts, and generate refunds in cash while leaving digital records intact. It didn't take a genius, just someone willing to poke around the back end while no one was looking. Here we go again with another shocking peek behind the curtain of a payments company that supposedly has Fort Knox level security. Turns out the unbreakable fortress is guarded by executives who couldn't spot a phishing email if it slapped them, and junior devs who stumble into live card numbers because nobody bothered to sandbox anything properly. Admin passwords share like office candy, real transaction data left lying around for testing, and gift card systems that basically hand out free money to anyone with 5 minutes and a bad attitude. Phantom refunds, rerouted charges, cash outs disguised as legit returns. All the audit trail smiles and waves. It's not a security system. It's a trust fall with a blindfolded toddler holding the rope. The only thing airtight is the delusion that certifications mean humans won't be lazy, greedy, or just plain incompetent. AITA verdict, not AITA. You were interface design, not security or back-end ops. You observed a dumpster fire of poor access controls, lazy credential management, and laughable separation of duties, none of which you created or exploited. Simply seeing how trivially insider fraud could happen and being stunned by it does not make you the problem. The real culprits are the people who built, approved, and maintained a system that vulnerable. You just had front row seats to the clown show. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Got a story to share? Drop it in the comments and let us know which one was your favorite.